What if a single word, misspoken or misplaced, could cost you everything? Not just your reputation, not just your savings, but your entire future. A single syllable, tumbling from a translator's lips, that unleashes a chain reaction of catastrophic failure, costing not thousands, but millions of dollars. An error so small it could fit on the tip of your finger, yet so powerful it could bankrupt a multinational corporation, ignite a diplomatic crisis, or leave a healthy young man quadriplegic for the rest of his life. This isn't a hypothetical. This is the hidden, terrifying power of language. We move through a world built on words, assuming a shared understanding, a common ground. But what happens when that ground gives way? What happens when the bridge of language, the very thing meant to connect us, collapses? You are about to enter a world where the smallest linguistic slip becomes a financial abyss, where a misplaced comma is a ticking time bomb, and a simple misinterpretation becomes a weapon of mass destruction. These aren't just funny gaffes on foreign road signs. These are the stories of how the world's most powerful brands and institutions were brought to their knees by a dictionary. The air in the South Florida emergency room was thick with panic. It was 1978. A young man, just 18 years old, named Willie Ramirez, was collapsing. His family, Cuban immigrants who spoke only Spanish, rushed him to the hospital, their words spilling out in a desperate, frantic torrent. They tried to explain what happened. He'd been at a party, he felt sick, he lost consciousness. They used the word intoxicado. To them, in their native tongue, it meant he was ill, poisoned, something was wrong with what he had eaten. It was a general term for feeling sick after ingesting something. But to the ears of the American paramedics and doctors, intoxicado sounded deceptively similar to intoxicated. One word, one tiny, fatal point of overlap between two languages. The medical team, hearing intoxicated, made a critical assumption. They treated Willie Ramirez for a drug overdose. A routine case, they thought. A teenager who had partied too hard. But Willie wasn't high. He was suffering from a brain hemorrhage. As the doctors treated him for the wrong condition, the bleed in his brain worsened. Precious hours, minutes, seconds ticked by, while the real problem raged unchecked. By the time they discovered their mistake, the damage was irreversible. The young, vibrant 18-year-old was left a quadriplegic. The misinterpretation of a single word resulted in a malpractice lawsuit that settled for $71 million. But no amount of money could ever give Willie his life back. That is the price of a single word. A price paid not in currency, but in a human lifetime. This is the terrifying reality that lurks beneath the surface of our globalized world. We build skyscrapers of commerce, diplomacy, and technology, all resting on the fragile foundation of translation. And when that foundation cracks, the entire structure can come crashing down. Consider the world of high finance, a place where precision is paramount. In 2005, the global banking giant HSBC was riding high. They had a powerful, reassuring slogan for their private banking division. Assume nothing. It was clever, confident. It told their wealthy clients that HSBC was diligent, that they left no stone unturned. The bank spent $10 million launching a global campaign built around these two words. They rolled it out across the world, confident in their message. But when the campaign hit numerous countries, it landed with a thud. In fact, it did worse than that. It was actively insulting. The translation teams had made a fatal error. Assume nothing had been translated in many languages to mean do nothing. Imagine seeing a billboard for a bank, the institution you trust with your life savings, that proudly proclaims, "We will do absolutely nothing for you." It was a catastrophe. The brand built on diligence and action was now synonymous with apathy and incompetence. The damage control was immense. HSBC had to scrap the entire $10 million campaign and spend millions more to rebrand, eventually settling on the slogan, "The World's Private Bank," a much safer, albeit less creative, alternative. The cost of those two simple words? Far more than the initial $20 million. It was a deep, lasting wound to their global reputation, a ghost that haunted their boardrooms for years. The corporate graveyard is littered with the tombstones of such linguistic blunders. Parker Pen, a manufacturer of luxury pens, wanted to expand into the Latin American market. They had a catchy slogan in English: "It won't leak in your pocket and embarrass you." The core message was reliability, avoiding a messy, embarrassing ink stain. When they translated this into Spanish, they thought they had a winner. The ad promised that the pen no goterá en tu bolsillo y te embarazará. There was just one problem. While embarazar looks like embarrass, it means something entirely different. It means to impregnate. So, across Mexico and Latin America, Parker Pen was proudly advertising, "It won't leak in your pocket and get you pregnant." It was a laughable, baffling failure that made the brand a joke instead of a status symbol. They had sought to sell sophistication and instead delivered a bizarre, nonsensical promise. These aren't isolated incidents. They are a pattern of cultural deafness that has cost companies fortunes. When Coors Beer brought their "Turn It Loose" slogan to Spain, the literal translation came out as "suffer from diarrhea." Not exactly the refreshing message they were hoping for. When the American Dairy Association expanded their iconic "Got Milk" campaign into Mexico, they failed to realize the literal Spanish translation, "Tienes leche," is an idiomatic phrase meaning, "Are you lactating?" Suddenly, their ads featuring famous celebrities with milk mustaches took on a very different and very awkward context. Perhaps one of the most famous examples comes from Pepsi in the 1960s. As they pushed into the massive Chinese market, they brought their wildly successful American slogan, "Come alive with the Pepsi generation." The translation seems straightforward, but in Chinese, due to a nuance in dialect and character choice, the slogan became something far more macabre. What Chinese consumers read on billboards and heard in commercials was a terrifying promise. Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the dead. In a culture with deep reverence for ancestors, this wasn't just a quirky mistake. It was profoundly unsettling, bordering on blasphemous. Instead of positioning Pepsi as youthful and vibrant, they had accidentally branded it as a tool of necromancy. The blunder became legendary, a textbook case taught in marketing schools around the world on the critical importance of not just translating words, but understanding culture. This failure to grasp cultural context is a recurring theme. The Swedish electronics giant Electrolux learned this the hard way when they tried to sell their vacuum cleaners in the United States. Their UK campaign had been a huge success with the slogan, "Nothing sucks like an Electrolux." In British English, sucks has one primary meaning, the function of a vacuum. It was a powerful, direct statement of the product's effectiveness. But when they brought that same slogan, unchanged, to America, they stepped onto a linguistic landmine. In American slang, sucks means is terrible, or is of poor quality. So American consumers were greeted with ads that, to their ears, proudly declared, "Nothing is as terrible as an Electrolux." It was an unmitigated disaster, turning a statement of power into a confession of worthlessness. Sometimes the error isn't in a slogan, but in the name of the product itself. When the Ford Pinto was introduced in Brazil, sales were abysmal. The company couldn't understand why this affordable, practical car wasn't selling. They conducted market research, analyzed the competition, and came up empty. The answer was right in front of them, on the back of the car. In Brazilian Portuguese slang, pinto is a vulgar term for male genitalia. People were literally laughing at the car. No one wanted to drive around in a vehicle named after a small penis. Ford was forced to swallow its pride and rename the car for the Brazilian market to Corcel, meaning horse. The delay, the rebranding, the lost sales, it all amounted to millions of dollars lost because no one had thought to consult a local slang dictionary. These stories may seem comical in hindsight, but they represent a fundamental and costly corporate arrogance, the belief that a message that works in one culture can be simply copied and pasted onto another. It is the failure to see language not as a set of interchangeable codes, but as the living, breathing soul of a people. But the consequences of mistranslation extend far beyond the balance sheets of corporations. They can rewrite history. They can escalate conflicts. They can, quite literally, shape the fate of nations. In July of 1945, the Second World War was nearing its brutal end. The Allied powers issued the Potsdam Declaration, laying out the terms for Japan's surrender. The final article was an ultimatum: surrender unconditionally, or face prompt and utter destruction. The declaration was broadcast to Japan, and the world waited for a response. The Japanese cabinet, led by Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, met to discuss the terms. They were in an impossible position. After a heated debate, they decided they were not yet ready to issue a formal response. Prime Minister Suzuki held a press conference. When asked about the declaration, he used the word mokusatsu. This is a famously ambiguous Japanese word. It can mean to ignore or to treat with silent contempt, but it can also mean no comment or to withhold comment for now, implying that a subject is still under consideration. Suzuki's intent was the latter. He was trying to say, we are considering it. No comment at this time. But the international news agencies translating his statement chose the first, more definitive, more hostile meaning. The headline that flashed across the world was not "Japan considers surrender terms," but "Japan rejects ultimatum with contempt." To the Allied leaders, particularly President Truman in the United States, this was seen as the ultimate act of defiance. It was the final straw. 10 days later, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. A few days after that, on Nagasaki. Historians will forever debate whether a different translation of mokusatsu could have changed the course of history, whether it could have averted the nuclear age's horrific dawn. But what is undeniable is that the ambiguity of a single word played a role in one of the most monumental and terrifying decisions in human history. The stakes could not have been higher. This shadow of mistranslation hangs over the entire history of modern diplomacy. During the height of the Cold War, a single phrase uttered by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sent a wave of terror through the Western world. At a reception at the Polish embassy in Moscow in 1956, speaking to Western ambassadors, he said a phrase that was translated as, "We will bury you." In the context of the nuclear arms race, this sounded like a direct apocalyptic threat. It was interpreted as a promise of nuclear annihilation. It dominated headlines, fueled anti-Soviet paranoia, and pushed the two superpowers closer to the brink of war. But was that what Khrushchev actually meant? The original Russian phrase, "My vas pokhoronim," is more nuanced. It's an idiomatic expression that can mean, "we will outlast you," or "we will be present at your funeral," in the sense that communism would historically supersede capitalism. It was still an aggressive, ideologically charged statement, but it wasn't the direct threat of nuclear attack that the English translation implied. Khrushchev himself later clarified, "I did not mean that we would bury you with a shovel. I meant that history is on our side, and that history will bury capitalism." But the damage was done. For years, "We will bury you" served as the terrifying encapsulation of the Soviet threat, a ghost born from a clumsy translation. Even seemingly minor diplomatic incidents can spiral out of control. When President Jimmy Carter visited Poland in 1977, the U.S. State Department hired a freelance interpreter who, it turned out, was not a professional. The results were disastrous and comical in equal measure. Carter's opening line, meant to be, "I have come to learn your opinions and understand your desires for the future," was translated into Polish as, "I desire the Poles carnally." The audience was stunned into a mixture of silence and laughter. Later in the same speech, when Carter spoke of leaving the United States, his interpreter rendered it as, "I have abandoned the United States, never to return." The entire diplomatic visit became a laughingstock. The interpreter was quickly replaced, but the incident became a symbol of American incompetence, an international embarrassment that cost goodwill and political capital. All because of a failure to invest in a qualified professional. These are not just simple mistakes. They are failures of empathy, failures of due diligence that occur at the highest levels of power. When legal contracts are mistranslated, the results can be just as devastating. A dispute between a European company and a Latin American partner hinged on a single word. The English contract stipulated that an event must occur by the half of the year. The European party understood this to mean by June 30th. The Spanish translation, however, used a phrase that meant in the second half of the year, meaning any time after July 1st. This 6-month discrepancy in the interpretation of a single phrase led to a breach of contract lawsuit worth over 50 million euros. The entire case revolved around the ambiguity introduced by a translator who failed to clarify the precise meaning. Even road signs, the most mundane and functional of translations, can become monuments to failure. In Swansea, Wales, a new road sign was needed to restrict heavy goods vehicles from a residential road. An official emailed the request to the council's translation service to get the Welsh wording. The Welsh text was duly painted onto the sign and erected. The sign read, in Welsh, Nid waith i ni swydfa ar hyn o bryd, enfonnwch unrhyw weith i'w gyfieithu, which translates to, I am not in the office at the moment, send any work to be translated. The official had mistaken the translator's automated out-of-office email reply for the actual translation. For days, drivers were greeted by a road sign that was essentially a public service announcement for a truant translator. The cost of replacing the sign was minor, but the cost in public ridicule was immense. In a similar vein, a sign at an airport in China, meant to direct people to a hall for ethnic minorities, was translated into English as racist park. In another instance, a sign on a grassy area in a park, which was supposed to say, keep off the grass, was translated with poignant, if unintentional, poetry, as do not disturb the tiny grass is dreaming. While we can laugh at these, they point to a deeper issue, a systemic carelessness that pervades our interconnected world. We have built systems of global communication that move at the speed of light, but we often neglect the slow, careful, human work of ensuring we actually understand each other. The rise of automated translation tools like Google Translate has only exacerbated the problem. These tools are marvels of technology, but they are not a substitute for human understanding. They translate words, but they cannot translate meaning, context, or culture. One company learned this the hard way when they used an automated tool to translate their website into multiple languages. On their Norwegian site, a simple tool used to calculate postage, called a shipping calculator, was translated as fartskalkulator. In Norwegian, fart means speed, so it should have meant speed calculator. But unfortunately for them, fart also happens to be the English word for flatulence. Norwegian customers, who often speak excellent English, were confronted with a button on the company's website that proudly offered them a flatulence calculator. It was a juvenile, embarrassing error that instantly destroyed the company's professional credibility. These are the unseen costs, the death by 1,000 paper cuts. A company in Israel that produced a line of kosher for Passover products accidentally used a machine translation that branded their products with the Hebrew equivalent of leprosy for Passover. A French company trying to sell chocolate mistletoe candies for the holidays was horrified to learn that in Germany, mistletoe is slang for manure. Sales, predictably, were non-existent. The thread that connects all of these stories, from the tragic case of Willie Ramirez to a bizarre road sign in Wales, is a profound underestimation of the complexity and importance of language. We treat translation as a simple act of substitution, of swapping one word for another, like changing the currency in your pocket. But it's not. It is an art form. It is the act of rebuilding a thought, an idea, an emotion, in a completely new architecture. It requires not just knowledge of vocabulary and grammar, but a deep understanding of culture, history, idiom, and the unspoken currents that flow beneath the surface of words. A professional translator is not a walking dictionary. They are a cultural bridge. They are the person who knows that assume nothing might mean do nothing, that embaraza is not embarrass, and that intoxicado is a cry for help, not a confession of indulgence. And failing to invest in that expertise, that human bridge, is one of the most foolish and costly gambles a person, a company, or a government can make. So what have we learned from this journey through a world of garbled messages and catastrophic misunderstandings? We've seen how a single word can alter a life, bankrupt a business, and even escalate the threat of war. We've seen that the cost of these failures isn't just measured in millions of dollars, but in lost opportunities, broken trust, and human suffering. The greatest translation fail isn't a funny sign or an awkward slogan. It's the persistent, dangerous illusion that understanding is easy. It's not. It requires effort, humility, and a willingness to listen. It requires us to recognize that behind every language is a unique world of thought and experience. To ignore that is to walk blindfolded through a minefield. The next time you see a poorly translated sign or laugh at a marketing blunder, remember the stories behind them. Remember the boardrooms that descended into panic, the diplomats who scrambled to undo the damage, and the family whose world was shattered by a single, misunderstood word in a hospital emergency room. Language is the most powerful tool we have, and like any powerful tool, in the wrong hands or used with carelessness, it can cause unimaginable destruction. Perhaps the most important thing we can ever learn to translate is not a foreign word, but a foreign perspective. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more journeys into the fascinating and often unseen forces that shape our world. And in the comments below, let us know, what's the most significant misunderstanding you've ever witnessed or been a part of? The stories we share are the bridges we build